We'll give this a few seconds to start. People are logging in now. And it's like, and we are also waiting for one of the panelists to join us. But thank you all for coming. So this is the first of two roundtables on political issues in the presidential election campaign. In this case, we're starting with foreign policy issues. The event is organized by the Center for Public Policy at the Hobby School of Public Affairs and the Center for International and Comparative Studies in the Department of Political Science. Professor Zack, Zwald, and myself, are the host of this series, and we have a great pleasure to bring this presentation with Gail Buttorff, who's a professor at the Hobby School of Public Affairs, Professor Chris Bronk in the College of Technology, Professor Tyson Chatagnier in the Department of Political Science, Professor Zack, who, as I mentioned, directs the Center for International and Comparative Studies and is a professor in the Department of Political Science, and Professor Lydia Tiede, who's having some technical issues but will be with us shortly. She's also in the Department of Political Science. So thank you, to the panelists, for joining us in this event, and for all the attendees. We're very excited to launch this series. I think it should be of interest to our students and the greater Houston community. I'm thrilled to have so many experts on campus who can talk about this wide range of issues associated with foreign policy and implications of elections. As we know, elections matter. So one of the points I want to discuss here is how the current U.S. foreign policy in the current environment might vary depending on who wins the election. But we want to have an overview of the main challenges, and we have experts on issues of trade, security, cybersecurity, human rights, regional issues, and so on. And we're looking forward to a great conversation. We'll start with presentations by the panelists, and then open up to a few questions, and allow the public, the attendees, to submit questions through the Q&A setting, and we'll try to get them, in the next 75 minutes for which we have slotted this presentation. So let me start with Professor Chris Bronk from the College of Technology. Chris, please tell us, what your thoughts are on issues of cybersecurity and election and other information issues.
Okay, so yeah, and you have to understand that for me, cybersecurity issues being front of mind as a policy issue is a radical departure from the past. When I started my PhD 20 years ago, I went to several professors and said, I'm really interested in cybersecurity as an international policy issue. And they all looked at me and said, you're nuts, go away, kid. Yeah, that's a waste of your time. Why don't you study democratic peace theory like a normal person? And I didn't. And that might be a bad thing, but I feel it's been a good thing. So there are a few things I just want to lay out pretty quickly and not take up too much time. The first one is a lot of people are worried about the election being compromised by some sort of hacking attack. I think what we've learned as things have dribbled out of the US government over the last 4 years, there's a lot of allegations and counter allegations, of course, but no one has said there was a massive widespread, hack of the election. There was a lot of computer hacking of computer systems related to campaigns at both the national, executive and legislative levels. And then there were also issues with hacks against different local, state repositories of information about voting. So voter registration lists, things like that. We've heard reports from the FBI and the intelligence community in the United States that there are things going on, but it does not appear that the kind of massive cyber action against the U.S. election is is rolling along to the degree it did in 2016. I saw a great point that someone made the other day, and they said, well, you don't need the Russians putting things into the narrative on the election now with regard to the legitimacy of the election and security, because the White House is doing a pretty good job of putting things out into the public that do make people question the legitimacy of an election. So the number one issue that I can speak to right now is that election legitimacy, and our vote's going to be tallied correctly. And when you have a sitting president who says, well, I don't really think it's going to work, that really undermines a lot of very hard work taking place at the Department of Homeland Security, inside the Department of Justice, and inside U.S. Cyber Command. We know that in the 2018 election, U.S. Cyber Command went after Russian trolls, as they're called, based in St. Petersburg. And the U.S. Cyber Command is probably pretty effective at blunting foreign cyber action against the United States if it can be traced and located and hunted down. The Cyber Command and the NSA have a lot of capability. Beyond that, as far as political issues, so I was on the 2008-2009 transition and wrote a white paper on the topic of digital issues. And so many of them seem so pedestrian now. Like, the United States should have a chief information officer who makes the government's IT run better. We should work better with Silicon Valley. All these things kind of came up. So these issues have changed radically because, now we're looking at, how does the United States Federal Election Commission work with the Department of Homeland Security to make sure that electoral, processes are followed? And there are some real issues there. Is the cyber problem different today than it was 4 years ago? Somewhat, but not a lot. A lot of the things that we've seen that were a big deal happened before that. It really happened on President Obama's watch. So, right now, what am I thinking about and writing about today? And Zach will see a draft of this shortly. I think he'll be pleased. But we have a military conflict going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan that no one's really talking or thinking about. And there's a cyber dimension to it. And it's going to be one of the first examples of where we have coalition warfare in cyberspace between two minor powers that are aided by less minor powers and some major powers. So things, every time it's like that there's a conflict now, there's going to be, I get a phone call, which is, hey, what's the cyber dimension to this? What do you think? Is Armenia doomed? So there's that. So U.S. Cyber Command is obviously doing more to protect the United States. There's a lot more going on. But the final thing that as a theoretician of information that concerns me about, so cybersecurity can be viewed as very narrow, like, who's been doing evil things to your computer. But it's also the broader question of information in cyberspace and how people make sense of information. And what I think has been most jarring for me, so I got to meet Daniel Patrick Moynihan when I was a graduate student. And, he had that famous quote of, you're entitled to your own opinion, but we share the same set of facts, which I heard Mike Pence paraphrase last night, which was interesting. But anyway, so, there are two issues. One is, I have a real issue with, we have this enormous edifice of an intelligence community in the United States that produces reporting and other things. Dismiss and say, oh, those spies, it's just all, hype or fake news or whatever. So that process is derailed. And, I think that's been a long time coming because, the cooking of the books on intelligence, in the 2003 Iraq war led to a lot of distrust and a lot of other problems. But now more recently, we just have a population that's basically like, well, I believe my facts come from this news outlet. I'm good with that. And my facts come from this other news outlet. and they're not commensurate. I mean, as someone who's been reading MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News side by side for months now, every day, it's amazing how different the news is. So the information ecosystem around our election, and it's how it's perceived globally, is just very different than anything I've ever seen before.
This was great. This is a great start. We're gonna try moving next to Lydia Tiede. I mean, it's like a professor in the political science department. There was some technical issues with a microphone. Hopefully it will work out. If not, I mean, we'll find another way around it soon. So Lydia, you told us you wanted, no, we cannot hear you, unfortunately. Maybe you could try calling in with your phone. I mean, it's like, and we can have someone add you, I mean, it's like later on. And so while Lydia tries to fix that, I mean, it's like, let's move next to Tyson Chatagnier, who's going to talk about foreign economic policy issues and multilateralism and the U.S. going along.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm glad to be here, and thanks everyone for attending this panel. So I do my work on economics and conflict, and I do a lot of work on trade, and so I'll be talking a little about the different kind of views of trade in these two, the Trump administration and the potential Biden administration as well. So just kind of give you some background here. There's sort of the way that the international trade works, right? There's a general sense that when we have fewer restrictions on it, that's better for everyone, right? So the idea is there's more economic efficiency with that, and kind of from a general sort of American perspective, for example, there's this idea that we like it when we can do things without being too encumbered, right? And so when we talk about restrictions on trade, we're talking about things like taxes. We're talking about things like the government enforcing some kind of quota or other restrictions on what can be bought or sold, right? And so the question is, can I buy and sell things from someone who's in, say, Italy or France or England in the same way I could buy and sell things from someone in Ohio or Missouri, right? And so there's a question of, well, how should we deal with this? And in general, we think that the fewer restrictions, the better in most cases. And this is kind of a broad view, right? That if we have relatively few restrictions, that's good for us on average. Now, the problem comes when some of these policies are put into place. While everyone benefits on average, there are specific winners and losers here. And so some folks might benefit more than others, and some folks might sort of have specific losses to themselves, right? So jobs that go somewhere else, or I was selling this and now people are buying it more cheaply from another country. And so there are sort of incentives on the part of those who represent folks who might see particularized losses to sort of advocate for some kind of protection there, right? And so Congress realizes this, and they realize that there are these sort of perverse incentives here. That what they would like to do is allow free trade generally, but for themselves have some protection for their own districts. And this leads to kind of deals being made. And so what they tend to do is they delegate this to the president. And the president generally has this more kind of 30,000-foot view. And so he's more willing to consider what's good for the country as a whole. And so over the last several decades, what we've tended to see is Congress delegating this authority to the president negotiating these kinds of deals. He used something called fast-track authority, was sort of developed in the 1970s for President Ford. And this allows the country to get these better trade deals here, right? So one of the issues here is that President Trump, while he hasn't been especially consistent on a lot of stuff, right? If you look at kind of President Trump's views in the 1980s, the 1990s, they're not quite the same as sort of what we saw in 2016 when he was running for president. But there's one area where he has been pretty consistent, and that's his opposition to trade, right? This general idea that the U.S. is better off when we do less trading with the rest of the world. And so that's what we've seen, right? So as President Obama is coming out of office, he negotiated this agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership in conjunction with a number of states in sort of the sort of Southeast Asia region and that kind of area. And as President Trump is running for office, he's saying that he's opposed to this. And in fact, when he gets elected, he scuttles this. Now the question is, well, what would a Biden administration do? And President or Vice President Biden has sort of mentioned that he was sort of in support of this. On the other hand, there's been kind of a move in sort of the populist left in the Democratic Party, right? So Senator Sanders in particular being kind of against these trade deals. So Biden and prior to him, Secretary Clinton had to kind of push themselves away from this. That having been said, what's likely to happen is if we do see a Biden administration come out of this election, we're likely to see the new president sort of negotiating a new deal, kind of trying to push the United States into this sort of agreement with these countries and sort of moving more into this kind of multilateral free trade in a way that we haven't seen with President Trump. We think about the sort of the tariffs with China, the trade war with China, we'd be likely to see less of that, right? So President Biden would have to kind of take a relatively hardline stance with a number of these things compared to, say, President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, just because politics are moving in that way generally. But you're going to see a more conventional presidency, I think, out of a Biden administration than you would out of a Trump administration when it comes to trade. One last thing I wanted to kind of mention before my time's up here is because I want to talk about multilateral issues more generally too. The Iran sanctions, which President Obama was sort of had gotten the United States as part of, where basically the U.S. and a number of other countries had agreed to sort of drop sanctions on Iran in exchange for sort of monitoring of of nuclear programs, promises not to continue with the development of nuclear weapons. And President Trump was concerned that Iran was cheating on the deal and wanted to pull the U.S. out of that and reimpose sanctions. A Biden administration would likely re-engage here, right? So they would sort of be constrained, I think, to take a more hardline stance than they would otherwise. But it's likely you would see some negotiation into that. You would likely see some more re-engagement and fewer sanctions on Iran. So I think that's my 5 minutes or so there, and I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Tyson. Let's try Lydia again, Professor Tiede. I mean, it's like hopefully this.
Can you hear me?
We can. Okay.
Yes, I had to shut the computer down, so thank you. I was worried it was something worse. So thank you for inviting me to be here. I was asked to speak about differences between a Trump or Biden win in November and its influence on international human rights protection. I think if Trump wins, we would not expect to see much different than we've seen in the last 4 years. This includes not holding countries who violate human rights accountable. So no action against countries such as China for the internment of ethnic Uyghurs, no action against them for civil liberty violations related to the people of Hong Kong, no action against Russia for annexation of the Crimea and the Ukraine, and human rights violations against its own citizens, such as the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. And we could see that he would also probably not do too much or take any action against other human rights pariahs. So I wouldn't expect that to change. I also don't expect his commitment to the United Nations as well as the US treaty obligations under our international human rights treaties to change. He's shown little support for UN human rights law or instruments. He withdrew the US from the Human Rights Council. There's been very little compliance with our obligations here in the US under international treaties, such as the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, for the Refugee Convention, for the Convention Against Torture, and the Civil and Political Rights Treaty. We don't see him we haven't seen him uphold those rights we're obligated to do under international law. He's also not done any of the reporting required by the committees that monitor these treaties. So for the implications for foreign policy for him is he's setting a bad example. You cannot criticize other countries or have any leverage on these other countries as far as human rights abuses if you're not holding up your side of the bargain. If you're not protecting your own citizens, how can you say much else to these other countries? Obviously, I think we would expect a very different approach from Biden if he should win. Biden himself spoke to the New York Times earlier this year and said, when I am president, human rights will be the core of US foreign policy. So I think under Biden, we'd see a renewed commitment to the United Nations to supporting its different human rights committees and having us rejoin the Human Rights Council, as well as upholding our obligations under the various UN conventions. Especially, you know, we've seen a lot, we should get better protection of individuals seeking asylum here, as well as having Biden hopefully speak a little bit more about protection of refugees abroad. So I think he would provide a better example and maybe would have more leverage. However, that said, I think we'll be returning to the status quo of under Obama. I don't know that that's anything, you know, to write home about, at least as far as immigration and refugee protections. Lots of Democrats from Clinton to Obama have not been too favorable to immigrants or refugees. Clinton passed some of the toughest asylum regulations in 1996. Obama deported lots of people. But again, as far as upholding our, I don't think we're going to see too much different than returning to the status quo of other Democratic presidents. Why this matters for foreign policy, again, is that if we're not doing, if we're not holding up our end of the bargain, it's really hard to speak out and be a leader on human rights policy for other nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. This is great. I'm happy that you were able to solve the technical
Yeah,
issue.
thank you.
Well, we're moving on. I mean, it's like speaking of sensitive areas, the Middle East has, I mean, taken, I mean, a big chunk of attention lately. I mean, it's like, and so we have Gail here who can give us, I mean, it's like some overview of what's going on there and implications for the US foreign policy in the near future.
Sure, thanks for having me. I think with regard to the Middle East, on average, from administration to administration, we don't see necessarily huge shifts in policies in the region. I think there's some key tenets that tend to be upheld at least superficially, and officials tend to pay some lip service. I mean, I think one of the main differences that from the Trump administration was in regard to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. That, you know, in the past, whether genuine or not, administrations have attempted to secure or at least work towards a peace process that would involve mutually acceptable terms to the conflict, whereas the Trump administration has sort of done away with this pretense and has put little effort in terms of securing a mutually acceptable settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But in speaking in general about some of the big issues in the Middle East, I know Chris brought up earlier, I mean, the sort of the resurgence of tensions and conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which are not, you know, technically in the Middle East and North Africa region, but, you know, Turkey's taken a very direct involvement in that conflict and supporting Azerbaijan, and Iran also has an interest because it shares borders with both those countries, and so that has some implications depending on the dynamics of that conflict, how that unfolds in the coming weeks. Of course, another major issue, you know, especially with the upcoming U.S. election, is the relationship with Iran and the U.S. and how that might shift under a Biden presidency or Biden administration versus a second Trump. Both Biden and Trump, you know, want to negotiate with Iran, but you know, the conditions under which those are going to occur will, of course, depend on who wins the election. And as Biden has signaled that he wants to rejoin the Iran nuclear agreement, with which the U.S. withdrew from previously unilaterally, it's unclear if Iran's going to be amenable to that. I mean, the foreign minister has said that, you know, we're not going to renegotiate until we're compensated billions of dollars for the sanctions that have been imposed, and other issues. One of the longer term issues, and I think, you know, this for the United States in terms of their national security interests, is the growing role of China in the Middle East and North Africa over the past decade. And again, this is not something we would necessarily see a dramatic shift from the current Trump administration to a Biden administration if he were to win. But the U.S. has definitely not been able to compete effectively with China in some areas. But there was some potential signal that the U.S. is growing more sort of concerned about it with the visit by the defense secretary to Algeria earlier this, I think maybe last week or recently, which was sort of one of the first high-level visits of a Pentagon official since, you know, in 14 years. So, and China has been heavily involved in Algeria for a long time. So I think I'll leave out at some of those issues.
This is great. So, Professor Buttorff just gave us an overview of a region that's quite central to U.S. interest. But one undercurrent topic here, and I know Professor Zwald is going to talk about it, is this idea of the unilateral and multilateral moments, right? It's like in U.S. foreign policy, I mean, that impact, and it's like, I mean, given the different geopolitical concerns, I mean, it's like, or concerns that are about issue areas like the ones that Professor Tiede and Bronk talked about, I mean, in terms of cybersecurity or Chatagnier on trade and human rights and the like. So I'm going to yield to my co-host here, Professor Zwald, to talk about these issues from the geopolitical perspective and issues of national security and the like.
Thank you, Pablo. And I'm going to second to what Pablo said and thank the rest of you for agreeing to participate, take time out of your schedules to do this. You know, foreign affairs is quite important, but isn't getting a lot of airtime in the media, right? So in conversations with my students as I teach Intro to International Relations, I see this notion that what we're talking about in class and what's happening in the elections, in their minds, are often happening in two spheres. And that's startling and frustrating for me. And so these sorts of forums are necessary to say that there are implications between this decision that we're all about to make and what the world looks like. And I don't think I'm going out too far on a limb to say that more than any other previous election in the last 80 years, there are two very distinct worldviews about how the US should move through the world. That if you look at any time in the post-World War II era up through 2016, there were lots of conversations about differing values and different policy emphases, but you kind of understood that a US foreign policy would be within a pretty narrow range of actions and preferences. But I think that President Trump, regardless of what one thinks about it, has really taken some big moves outside of the traditional mainstream, which has been, since 1945, more multilateralist, right? So today I want to take that big theme that I think has been an undercurrent of all of these presentations and talk about how they apply to, one, how the US under Trump versus Biden will treat our alliances, and two, how we'll proceed on nuclear weapons issues, with nuclear proliferation being one of these consensus issues of biggest or most pressing international security threats. So the first thing I want to get at, and again, I think this has been present throughout the other presentations, is that to the extent that Trump has a coherent foreign policy, it is this America First brand of unilateralism, right? And at first glance, many would say, putting America first isn't uniquely Trumpian, right? That's every American foreign policy is realist in its orientation, putting US national interests above and beyond all other interests. But what's unique about President Trump, in his words and in his deeds, has been considering, one, the explicitly nationalist language which he consistently uses, and focusing only on relative gains concerns with respect to allies and on these collective security issues. So if we look at alliances, and in particular, I want to zero in on NATO, and then our East Asian alliances with Japan and South Korea. President Trump campaigned, and a few of us on this panel were on a panel before and after the 2016 election. He campaigned saying that, you know, these alliance structures are outdated. They're a thing of the past and they're sucking our money away. And I remember some debate among us where there was differences of opinion of, you know, oh, that's campaign Trump, not going to be governing Trump. Nope, that was governing Trump as well. So, you know, going into 2016, he said, let's maybe give the South Koreans and the Japanese nukes, let them have them, and we'll go our own way. Traditionally, for those, you know, that aren't enmeshed in all of this, they have been explicitly under our nuclear umbrella since the 1950s. So one, disavowing our security guarantee to them. Two, saying that they should get nuclear weapons was huge. Since then, with respect to the East Asian allies, President Trump has repeatedly made this an issue of how much the other states are paying in terms of burden sharing with the United States, which again, in and of itself is a very normal American concern that perhaps we are doing more than our fair share. What's different here is that the Trump administration has requested, for instance, that South Korea pay 5 times more than their annual $1 billion payment. And if they do pay 5 times more, we would operate as on a profit in South Korea. He has also repeatedly mentioned that how much military exercises in both of these countries cost. And unilaterally, in a conversation with Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korea, agreed to cancel last year's US Republic of Korea military exercises, which are widely seen as instrumental in demonstrating our commitment and resolve to our extended deterrent commitment. When we go to NATO, it's a similar story, right? We hear a lot of tough talk toward Germany and the rest of our traditional mainstay allies that they're not paying their fair share. And that the fact that they're not meeting their 2% of their GDP military spending requirements means they are exploiting the United States. And President Trump has floated many times that if they don't pay their fair share, then maybe we'll abandon the treaty. Which, when you have a resurgent Russia that has taken territory in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, is repeatedly expressing a desire to coerce its former Soviet states, weakening American commitment to NATO is, in a neutral way, a big departure from previous administrations. When we move to nuclear weapons issues, in short, there seems to be just a general distaste for treaties and for working through multilateral negotiations, whether it be Iran that a few of you have mentioned. We pulled out of this treaty without any real alternative plan. Wasn't a perfect treaty. There were claims that Iran had cheated. Ultimately, the factual record shows they didn't cheat with the accord, but they were doing lots of other things that the Trump administration didn't like. And so we pulled out of that treaty. With North Korea, rather than going through a multilateral process involving South Korea and Japan and China, President Trump said, I'm gonna get in a room with Kim Jong-un, sit down, look him in the eye, and work this out, person to person. 3 of these personal engagements later, their nuclear program proceeds apace, and the regional dialogue that had taken multiple administrations to develop is sort of collecting dust. With Russia, this year we actually have the New START Treaty, a strategic nuclear arms agreement that is up for renewal. And the president said, well, I'm not gonna make any move on this until China gets in the conversation. China is building up to where the US and the Russians are, so they're in no hurry to get involved, which means we're about to let our biggest arms control agreement lapse with the Russians. I'll pause there since I think that's my time, but as a kind of a summation comment, I would be interested in hearing what the other speakers have to say. As I went through these couple of issues, looked at the conventional wisdom multilateralist perspective that Biden represents and the divergent unilateralist perspective that Trump represents, I then try to engage the hypothetical, what does the first year of a Biden administration look like? Is it just a return to normal? And the conclusion I reached was probably not. That on the one hand, the strategic environment has shifted out of our favor over the last 4 years to an extent that the challenges presented by an expanding China and Russia are more daunting. And at the same time, a lot of public opinion studies have shown we don't have the stomach for it anymore in this country. Across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, we are not interested in continuing this 20th century era leadership position. And that whether you're on the Bernie left or the Trumpian right, you are against recommitting initiative to what was viewed as the status quo. So I'd kind of be interested in knowing, you know, of course we want to hear what the audience has to say, but I'd also be interested in knowing what you guys think about from my perspective, a rather pessimistic conclusion that to the extent that you think the ship has gone off course, there's a limited chance for a Biden administration to right that ship.
Thank you so much, Zach, and all for the presentations. I have a number of questions that I would like to follow up, but I have one that came from one of our colleagues and who's at the audience, which speaks to the last topic that Professor Zwald raised, and is an undercurrent in the other 4 presentations today. So the question is that, I mean, it's framed in the following terms. So there appears to be some damage, and some people say that's significant over the past 3.5 years on the reputation of the U.S. in relation to our allies and other countries in the world about being a trustworthy partner. Okay? So again, what will it take for the U.S. to earn the trust? And it's like from other nations or regain credibility? Is it even possible? And then add a second part, and it's like, do we foresee any efforts by the 2 administrations that could be inaugurated in January into rebuilding those relationships? So again, I mean, it's like, feel free to chime in. I mean, it's like, and let's make it a conversation.
I'll let someone else chime in since I just basically spoke to my perspective on this question.
Any takers? I mean, it could be specific to some of the issues that you discussed. I mean, it's like, and if not, I mean, I'll try to poke some of the answers from you shortly, but I'll let you answer first on the question.
So I can say a few words on that. So I think that and Zach, I guess, kind of alluded to this at the end of his comments there. This idea that there has been something of a shift, I think. Both in terms of, like, once you've kind of moved your policies in a certain way, it's really hard to kind of pull back the other direction, right? So the U.S. foreign policy is like this big ship that just takes a lot of effort to turn one way or another, and it's turned in a significant direction away from what it was before. And so, you know, on one hand, there's this idea, kind of, I think that, oh, you know, President Trump is an aberration. He's very different from the other presidents we've seen. And it's likely that, you know, the U.S. goes back to these kind of conventional presidents in the future. But I'm not sure that that's kind of what we can expect, right? I mean, I think that you know, whether you like what President Trump has done or you don't, the sorts of things that he's done, I think, have fundamentally changed a lot of the way that the rest of the world sees the U.S. And even if the U.S. does go back to, if Biden is sort of a conventional president in the U.S. and he does want to kind of go back to these kind of this way of viewing things. There's always this chance that, well, what happens 4 years after that, right? Does the U.S. elect another president who kind of has a similar view to Trump? And again, as Zach sort of mentioned, it's not necessarily a left or right thing, right? Because a lot of this is sort of about this kind of rise of populism on both sides, and kind of a distrust of the conventional way of approaching international politics. And so I think that that there's always going to be this specter of, well, what if, right? And so kind of planning out these long-range strategic commitments becomes a lot more difficult when you know that the U.S. can kind of go off course at any time.
So one issue we didn't discuss in terms of these multilateral versus unilateral approaches, and it's like, are these intergovernmental organizations like the UN, and it's like the WTO, even alliances that we talked about briefly today. So I'm going to ask you, I mean, it's like, and then speak about the specific issues that you have brought us. I mean, it's like, what could those institutions, organizations do for us? And it's like, is there any way that we might go back to them to try to resolve the issues that you identified? I mean, it's like that pop up in international affairs that make, I mean, the US and the world less secure. One of those points, I mean, I think it might be interesting to get Lydia's take on the element of the UN Security Human Rights Council. I mean, it's like, and the US participation, right? I mean, it's like on those areas, right? I mean, it's like, so what do you think, Lydia? I mean, it's like about.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's not the only one that pulled out of the Human Rights Council. I mean, under Bush, we did as well. I think there's going to be an eagerness of Biden to get back to some of those relationships, at least to appear on the surface that, you know, we're rejoining, having alliances with countries that share, strong human rights values. However, these institutions don't work very well, right? Because we have, with the voting in the Security Council, a lot of times we can't really do much, right? So people get very frustrated with the international human rights system. So I think there's going to be a move back to trying to rejoin those alliances, look like a good participant. I don't think the US, though, is going to take the lead and try to move human rights policy internationally or make countries do more than we do already. But I think he will try, at least in human rights, to move back based on his statement that he wants his foreign policy to be based on human rights, and also just the fact that, these are long alliances he's had, right, with a lot of these countries being an international player. Whether the international system actually promotes and does what it's supposed to do as far as protecting human rights is another question, which I think lots of people are skeptical whether the US joins or rejoins. Does it serve the purpose of protecting international human rights in the way it was hoped to do?
Would it be consequential? My follow-up question on that. Suppose that the US reengages, I mean, it's like the Human Rights Council. Should we expect that to have an impact in the way that human rights violations, I mean, it's like happen?
Yeah, I think around the edges. I mean, again, I think there'll be certain things where a different interest that's not human rights will be thought of as more important than the human rights interest. But on other issues, maybe so. So maybe, Trump, even on Venezuela, they have taken a stronger, stance against Maduro, but they haven't really done anything. So maybe, maybe Biden would do something, right, if he had some support. Will it be consequential? I think around the edges, right? I think on countries we can influence that don't affect other strategic concerns, yes. But again, we don't have the best history on promoting international human rights either.
So let me take that. Well, yeah, one second. I want to bring in, I mean, it's like, since we're talking about international institutions, I mean, it's like the two issues that I want to talk to, I mean, it's like Professors Buttorff and Bronk. On Gail's, you mentioned the Middle East. Do you see any role, I mean, it's like for any international organization, I mean, it's like helping prop a peace plan for the Middle East, or has that ship sailed and it just require, I mean, it's like the US, I mean, it's like, and some of the regional allies.
I'm sorry, for a peace plan for like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Policy and stability in the Middle East, I mean, it's like including, I mean, some of the tensions that are currently going on with countries in the region. So even,
sure. Yeah, I think there's a role, and I think under a Biden administration, they will seek to re-engage our allies just to renegotiate a deal with Iran, a new nuclear deal with Iran. And I think that's when you'll see the international community, because you'll also need Russia, China, and the European Union to be involved in those negotiations and any deal. I mean, I think potentially under either administration, you might also see a wider group. I mean, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries in particular were quite upset about the original Iran deal because they were left out of the negotiations. And I think potentially in any new negotiations, the GCC countries along with Israel might be potentially engage to make that a more long-term deal and sort of help stabilize some parts of the Middle East. But the other big issue is, the COVID, like everywhere, has devastated the economies, and even some of the GCC states like Kuwait, for example, who just lost their longtime leader, are suffering economically. And so there are some stability issues, of course, related to the economic crises that these countries have been facing for a long time, but then have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. So, I think the main part for multilateral and international organizations will be with the Iran deal, potentially also Syria or the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict with the Minsk group. But other than that, it's, the international organizations don't have necessarily a same pull with like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example.
Zack, before I move to Chris, it's like if you had something you wanted to comment on this, but I have a specific question for Chris.
No, I was actually gonna maybe toss it to you and Tyson and Chris, in the sense that we haven't talked a lot about China and the Road and Belt Initiative, and the idea that at the same time that we have this weird left-right point of consensus against further international frameworks for our trade, China has been expanding and filling in that vacuum. So to you guys that look at these political economy issues, what chance, if any, is there in us regaining ground on forming a Western institutional counterweight to China? And then to Chris, something that he alluded to earlier that we are working on is this notion of hybrid conflict. This notion that going forward, we're not likely to see direct military confrontation, but we're going to be operating in this peace, not peace, war, not war, friends, maybe frenemies, and conflict will look, at least that's what leading thinkers are saying today, conflict will look more like Ukraine 2014 than a direct state-to-state military conflict. And in that context, you're going to have influence operations, and cyber is going to play an unprecedentedly dominant role. And so I was curious to know what Chris's thoughts were on, the extent to which a Biden versus Trump presidency would have any impact in that issue area.
Let me bracket the trade and China's engagement, in particular in the Pacific for now, and send this to Chris, because the question I had for him, which is related to this issue, is that is there any role for international cooperation to reach both cybersecurity and manipulation of information and the like? So, or is it just that each of the countries have to fend for themselves and there's no role for any possibility? So the point I want to make is what are the policies that need to be enacted to reduce this level of cybersecurity concerns, right? That might lead to lower conflict among the countries, right? And what would be, the differences that the two administrations may have on how to approach it, both maybe unilateral, multilaterally, if that possibility exists.
There was an article, back when we thought in the mid-90s that what was going on in the Balkans with the breakup of Yugoslavia, I think we were all, I was an undergraduate student and I was pretty horrified by what I saw. And the idea, of my generation, we didn't see Europeans doing heinous things to each other until Yugoslavia broke up, basically. And this time, is different. Obviously, we have different things coming apart, but Yugoslavia's breakout really taxed the international community on how to deal with this problem. And there was an information dimension there too. And the thing I always worry about in these cyber conflicts where we talk about a semantic component, what's the message? It's these messages that divide peoples and groups. and cause conflicts internally. So, you know, I saw something this morning that the United States should be outing corrupt Chinese officials. So sorry, Pablo, to bring in China, but the idea that the US intelligence community should collect intel on Chinese mayors and provincial leaders and party apparatchiks, and when they do something egregiously bad, as would be perceived by their people, the United States government should, you know, produce a leak. But you know, you go back to Yugoslavia. There was a paper written then that I reread not long ago by Edward Luttwak, who some people on this call might hate and some people might like. I have no strong opinion in either direction, but he wrote this very provocative paper, Give War a Chance. The idea that Yugoslavia had to fight itself out. There have been these deep-seated animosities that came out of the Second World War between the Croats and Serbs especially. And this has gotten me to thinking, you know, and I'll be very blunt. You know, I see President Trump as a profoundly non-democratic leader. He does not seem to have a lot of regard for democratic institutions or the democratic process or the franchise or any of the rest of it. So I'm just gonna, you know, fly those colors now. And, you know, the piece that I've been toying with that I probably will never completely put to paper is, you know, give dictatorship a chance. You know, America, do you want a wake-up call on you know, civic responsibility and the you know, what needs to be negotiated for pursuing an agenda that guarantees your rights? Well, you know, maybe a dictatorship will show you, you know, how bad things really can get. Because we've seen this. We've seen where dictatorial regimes, you know, really can undermine a society's understanding of human rights, of political expression and freedoms. So I don't think I'm going to write this. I'll let Zach write the Give Dictatorship a Chance paper. That's something maybe he wants to dive into a little more than me. But, you know, this is the big issue that I see here is there are an increasing number of states around the world that have said, you know, when we were naive in the 1990s, we thought, oh, the internet is going to lead to this, you know, direct democratization thing where people will talk to bureaucrats and bureaucrats will talk to elected officials and it'll all be faster and better. And that's hooey. That didn't happen. I mean, maybe it happened in some cases, but in the main, we've seen a lot more divisiveness, a lot more, you know, difference of opinion. So when I look at the two administrations, I mean, you know, I asked an advisor of Hillary Clinton's when I was working for her, you know, and I said, you know, did you guys end up coming to work for Hillary on this digital stuff because Hillary got beaten by Barack Obama on fundraising because of an iPhone app? And they said, pretty much. Mrs. Clinton realized the internet was a big deal after the iPhone allowed Barack Obama to raise more money in any presidential campaign up to that point. So, you know, is there room for international norms? You know, my friend and colleague Chris Demchak up at the Naval War College has a whole coalition of the interested on cyber issues that she you know, is promoting. You know, I crossed paths with her in Scandinavia last fall when she was on basically that speaking tour. And there are countries that are interested in doing the right thing and, you know, promoting democratic values and moving into this new information paradigm that we live in because of mass connectivity and those things. So I think the choice is rather stark. I think a continuation of what we have now, you know, will lead me to fear additional surveillance and monitoring here at home. And, you know, just the idea that we don't promote freedoms for expression and for the press. I mean, I am still horrified by the Khashoggi affair, and that Saudi Arabia basically washed its hands of it, you know, and the necessary people were punished. But you know, a reporter for the Washington Post was killed and, you know, cut to pieces in a diplomatic facility for what he said, and the United States did very little, if anything, about it.
Let me remind the audience that we are willing to take questions from them. If willing, we have a few, like 20 minutes left, but in the meantime, I'll bring it back to Tyson. I mean, it's like, and punt the question that Zach put on me. I mean, it's like for you to answer in terms of the impact of multilateral institutions in the areas of trade. But one that we didn't talk about, I know that you might be willing to talk as well, is this issue of environmental, I mean, it's like degradation and what to do about it. And it's like, and potentially and relatedly, I mean, it's like the issue of the spread of global pandemics. I mean, it's like, and whether or not there's a role for multilateral, I mean, it's like cooperation to try to deal with those issues.
Thanks. So Zach mentioned earlier that around the time of the 2016 election, we had some of these other panels, and I remember talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership at the time, which Secretary Clinton was kind of distancing herself from to some degree, but it was pretty clear that she probably would be on board with it if she won, and candidate Trump at the time was very much against it. And the concern was, well, if the United States doesn't join this kind of this trade agreement with the Southeast Asian countries and the Oceania countries, that opens the door for China to sort of step in there, right? Because one of the issues that China has in terms of sort of rising in power is regionally, it's pretty distrusted. There's a lot of history there, and you look at like these opinion polls of folks in Southeast Asia and outside of China, they're not very favorable to China. Now, you allow them to start stepping in and getting involved in sort of some of these multilateral agreements like trade agreements. That kind of helps them to gain this leadership role, to gain kind of a positive perspective from some of the other countries. And so the concern is if the U.S. kind of abdicates its role in promoting trade and promoting sort of organization with these other countries and taking this kind of leadership role, well, the door's open for someone else to do it. And who else is going to step in? Well, China is likely to step in a lot of these cases. And now, the evolution of the TPP into the CPTPP, which is ultimately sort of what's enforced right now, it doesn't include China at the time, right? But at the present. But there is talk about China getting involved in it, at some point in the future. And so I think there are certainly concerns about, if the U.S. does continue this kind of unilateral move, what does that mean for the U.S.'s role in the international system? And I think the answer is, well, the U.S. would start to step down a bit, China would step up, and what you think about that probably has something to do with your preference for unilateral versus multilateral stuff in general, because you might not care in general. If what you care about is just kind of internal politics, that's fine. But that's likely what's going to happen, right? And so that's something that has to be considered. On some of the other multilateral agreements, right? So the Paris Climate Accord, for example, which is the U.S. was sort of a party to. President Trump, when he was running for office, kind of was very, very sort of vociferously against it, and said, he had an intent to pull out of it, and indeed sort of announced it's sort of a 4-year process, right? So he announced the intent to withdraw, and last November the U.S. then formally announced its intent to withdraw, and it's not until I think it's the day after the election this year actually that the U.S. will be able to sort of actually pull itself out of that treaty if President Trump decides that's what he wants to do. If Vice President Biden wins, it's likely the case that he would try to sort of reaccede to that agreement, which is sort of not immediate, but something that could be done without too much of a hassle. Now the question is, and I think Lydia kind of addressed this with like human rights. How much of some of these treaties and agreements, how effective are they, right? So even if the U.S. rejoins the Paris Initiative, are we likely to cut carbon emissions? Well, I think that's a good question. Even under a Biden administration, it's going to be tough to get Congress to kind of get on board with some of the stuff that it would require. And so a lot of this is to some extent signaling, right? So it's President Trump signaling his feelings about what the international system should look like and what the U.S.'s role is. It would be President Biden's signals about sort of caring about sort of multilateralism, or at least a veneer multilateralism at the very least, and making it appear that there are these kinds of organizations through which the U.S. should be working. So I would expect to see, if we have this change, a sort of a return to engagement, but the degree to which it actually has an effect, I'm not really sure in some of these cases. And you mentioned pandemic response, Lydia.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think one of the issues that's really become clear is that, at least with human rights, but lots of other issues that I don't know so much about, what we have set up as far as legal structures or protections and all these things aren't working and aren't gonna work in the current world, right? Like, we have no provisions for dealing with the migration flows we are gonna see with climate change. We don't have that. We do not have anything set up for coordination on things like pandemics that will continue to happen. So there should be some forethought about rejoining and having better multilateral efforts. But what we have now, it doesn't even begin to answer some of the issues we're going to be facing moving forward.
Could I just piggyback on what Lydia just said? Because it occurred to me from Chris's answers to Tyson's to Lydia's, maybe a panel of academics is considering this too self-serving to discuss, but there has been a degradation in the esteem to which policy experts are held in this administration. So whether it's scientific experts in the context of climate change or pandemics, or the folks that are just looking outside of a partisan lens and seeing there are very traumatic climate effects that are causing migration flows, and we need to have an international response to that this isn't an American first sort of situation, that it's just a problem. It's just a problem that's happening, that's new in its scale, and we need to have technocrats address this. So one thing, I mean, my hope, I guess, the silver linings, I don't think I've been hopeful today, that my silver lining under a Biden administration is simply just the resurgence of a neutral technocracy, right? That isn't cast out as the deep state, and all these folks that are very neutral and just pleasantly boring in how they're focusing on just problems outside of party and politics, that they get the chance to do their job again.
Yeah. And some forward thinking. I mean, the problem is these problems like the migration flow, you don't get asylum or refugee status because you left a climate change event, right? So we don't practically know what to do with these people. Plus, that's going to be, people need to look forward.
Right. There are all these on the horizon, practical, just problem-solving exercises that needn't be partisan. And it seems like a resurgence of that problem-solving, non-partisan space would be, I mean, such a neutral step forward, but a big improvement.
There's a question from one of my favorite political philosophers, and it's like, who's in the audience, Professor Jeff Church, and it's like, he's asking you to move away from your role as academics and think about, and it's like, imagine that you become Biden's foreign policy advisor after if he were to win the election. So what would be your advice for making the biggest priority for US foreign policy? Who wants to take on that? So think about as an advisor, I mean, and not an academic. Chris, please.
Outside of my area completely, but climate change. I mean, when we look at what sea level rise will do to cities like Miami and New Orleans and possibly our own city, New York, my hometown, that's the thing I look at. And, and then I wanted to weave this in somehow. I inherited my dad's American flag that he used to hang in front of his house a while back. And I needed to get a bracket to put it on the front of the house. And my kid said, "You're going to hang the American flag on the front of the house? What does that say?" And I was like, "What do you mean, what does that say?" So, the second thing is that, and I think this is a foreign policy issue for the United States, but essentially to be a trustworthy player. And American exceptionalism, of late has been exceptionally bad for America. So policy issue, climate change, but issue to the world is, how does the United States again lead from a positive position and not squabble over, everything, including, wearing these guys. This became a partisan issue. How do we end that?
Any other takers of climate change? And it's like, Gail, you want to go ahead?
Well, not on climate change per se, but I think piggybacking on what Lydia was saying about migration and refugees is going to be a continued issue, both from conflicts and climate change and climate disasters, but then also, you'll continue to see migration from because of lack of economic opportunities in many countries. And, like within the region of the Middle East where I focus is, a lot of those economies were suffering before, and the pandemic has exacerbated it. And you see increasing numbers of people, or of young people, wanting to migrate. And so I think there needs to be a sort of more attention to both the various causes of mass migration that we're going to see, and not just refugees. Biden has said that he's going to increase the number of refugees to 125,000 up from 18, whereas Trump says we're going to limit to 15,000 in 2021. But, thinking again with our partners who, like especially the European Union, who get the bulk of these initial flows, of how we can create more international partnerships to deal with these mass migrations that are going to continue, either because of conflict, because of climate change, or because of economic recessions and collapse in many countries.
I think we should say that having a holistic approach to policy problems is not new, right? I mean, the previous administration led with this notion that climate change and a lot of the human rights issues and the mass migrations and terrorism and proliferation are all part of intertwining trends, and that they're not these separate issues, but that they have underlying common regional instabilities, and we need to focus on sort of root causes. But that, you can't just take these piecemeal, and you definitely can't consider some of the facts at hand to be political, to go back to Chris's point. I mean, we can't have effective policymaking if the baseline facts, 14-day quarantine, everyone should do it, are in dispute.
So let me, I'll let you lead in a second. First, I want to tell to the audience that if you ask questions, I'm not going to put you in the spotlight like they did with Professor Church. So it's like they could be anonymous. But the second point is that I see, and maybe where Lydia is taking this now is we can pick any of these issues, right? It's like migration, climate change, trade, it's like the cybersecurity and the like. And I see that, again, the undercurrent here is more, it's like how we approach the problems as opposed to which one we prioritize, because I can see a connection between many of these issues, right? It's like trade, migration, it's like the pandemic and health issues and so on are all, it's like elements that of this war that is completely interconnected, right? It's like, and that doesn't mean, it's like that we have not, stepped away from interconnectedness in the past, right? It's like, so we lived through moments where the US isolated itself from the world, it's like, right? And it had consequences, right? It's like at the time. So the issue that I see here is that maybe the undercurrent is not so much which is the main priority, but how we approach these problems and how we put emphasis on, it's like on those problems that could help, it's like address several of the main challenges that we face at once, right? Sorry, Lydia, I didn't want to take your time.
Oh, no, I think it's really just what you were saying. I think the big issue is that we're just everyone's undermining themselves. It's like we need some kind of coordinated efforts to deal with all these problems. Why is it that you have a mayor of Medellin in Colombia that has like thought ahead and actually saved, you know, his population because he used data and he protected them, right? We all had, you know, the lack of coordination on some of these huge issues is astounding. And there's lots of smart people out there that can solve these problems, but it's almost as if, and it's not just the US, it's all these countries, right? This inability to sort of engage together, you know, we could not waste so much time, right? You see what happened with the states and the federal government here, and that happens on a global level as well. So I think you're exactly right that this needs to be, how do we approach all these huge issues?
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering, what do you guys think about the prospect of a Biden administration being able to push toward what Lydia is describing, of a more coordinated effort, one within this country, two among the international community?
So my biggest worry is the one that that Chris raised, and it's like the idea is that we become, it's like so polarized, right? And that it's hard to find a common ground that will allow us to build, and it's like a common, and it's like enterprise that would help us solve the issues at hand. We can think about Biden, but the other, question I would like to pose to you related to this is like, if Trump were to win, and it's like, right, it's a possibility of that, it's like a non-trivial, and he pulled it off 4 years ago, and it's like, what would, how would he approach these problems? Because the problems exist. They're not going to go away even if he wins, right? So do we see more of the same? Do we see him pivoting? Do we see him pivoting in some areas and not others? So what's your take?
My take is he will not touch anything that doesn't have a good political endgame. If it looks troubling or it won't appeal to his base, he will not engage it. Just pretend the problem isn't there.
So you see more unilateral, and it's like an America first, and it's like type of approach, more isolationism. Or you think we're gonna go back to the early 20th century?
My only problem with applying the ism to it is that it seems like it's a coherent worldview that is based on a notion of what's in America's interest, and I don't think there is a coherent American foreign policy worldview motivating President Trump. I think it is more than we have seen ever before, motivated by narrow political self-interests. And there are multiple disjuncts between American national interests and personal Donald Trump political interests, and he ignores those. And the pandemic is one. The Iran nuclear deal, many people have talked about this. We got nothing from pulling out of that. And the chances, in my estimation, of us going back to that are nil. We don't have anything to bring to the table. So there are time after time where he did things for his own political interests that long-term, I can't find an interpretation of how they benefit American national interest.
Very positive. No, let me run around the clock so we can wrap this up, because our time is soon gone. And I'd like you to make some final comments before closing. Who wants to start? And it's like, Lydia, you want to take a bite at this?
Yeah, I guess just the whole, I think the worry is even under Biden, we have so many stresses, and many leaders have so many internal stresses that even if there was a idealized version that, yes, we do want to have more multilateralism, we want to be forward thinking to solve these big problems, you're really going to have good experts, kind of what Zach was saying, and people that are informed and engaged, because all these nations are facing threats within and outside. And so just having enough resources and engagement, I think it's going to be key, even if it is Biden. Right? It's a lot of issues to deal with. Even things like, getting more people employed, that's going to come back and affect taking refugees in this country, right? Because if people don't have jobs here, even under Biden, people are going to really balk at having more people coming in, and, people are always concerned about having their jobs taken. Whether that's true or not, that threat. So I think there just has to be more effort.
Tyson?
kind of going to this idea of what 4 more years of a Trump administration look like. I think Zach is right in part on sort of not being I don't know that there is a coherent Donald Trump worldview. I do think that he has, as I said earlier, very strong views on trade, and so I would expect us to see more of the sort of hostile interactions with China on trade issues, more of this kind of protectionism that we see. But I think a lot of the other stuff depends in part on who is running things, or who the advisors are. And we've seen a lot of turnover, right? So one of the things I do in my American foreign policy class, I talk about who the national security advisors are for each president. And when we get to President Trump, there are like 6 or 7 of them in like a 2-year span, which is as many as you had over the previous 3 presidents. And so there's a question of, well, who will be on board in a Trump administration 2021 to 2025? And the thing is, I don't know for sure who it's going to be, and I think that has a role in determining what foreign policy in the U.S. is going to look like for those 4 years. And so I think there's a much larger confidence interval on a Trump administration 4 years in the future, despite the fact that we've seen 4 years of Trump already. Whereas Biden, I think we have an idea of what he would do, and I agree with Lydia. The effectiveness of some of it is I think questionable.
Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add. I agree. I think, with regard to the Middle East, I'm not sure under a second Trump administration we'd see that much difference in how the administration approaches a number of issues there. And under Biden, given his foreign policy team, probably would be much like under Obama or Clinton, because all of them are veterans from those 2 administrations. So, but as others have pointed out, how much they're going to be able to return to that status quo that many of the foreign policy advisors are, sort of comfortable with is, I think, a very good question, because of what Zach pointed out earlier, like the strategic environment has shifted, and it's shifted away from the United States, that it's going to be difficult to return to, an Obama era status quo, whether you agree with that or not.
Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to pull in one more thing from completely out in left field. One of the things that I would really hope for, and I think is very negative about the current administration, is essentially the policies enacted to limit the United States drawing foreign students and foreign thinkers, technicians. I mean, when people say, "Oh, immigration's bad," blah 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 blah, all these foreigners in our tech sector, I like to remind people that my grandfather, Gunther Grieshaber, worked for a company called Norden that invented a bomb site that dropped tons and tons and tons of bombs all over the Axis, including his homeland, as an American. And I think that if we look at one of these other macro issues, it's a real problem for our country going forward. It is, I always was under the impression that we had an open door, so the Gunther Grieshabers could come to America and do better than they did in their home country, but also improve the well-being for all of us. And I think that's, as I learned, the political expression in Mexico, the punto clave, as an academic for me, is that we need to advocate on a daily basis for why people from other countries need to come to the United States to learn, to teach, and to invent in a way that is Pareto optimal, that really expands the pie.
Zack, your final word? I'm muted.
I'll concede. I really appreciated these follow-on comments, and I think perhaps Jeff his comment was good at shaking off the scholar hat and talking more personally. So I like the way we wound it up.
So thank you. I mean, Professor Bronk, Professor Buttorff, Professor Chatagnier, I mean, Professor Tiede and Professor Zwald. I mean, it's like, this was fabulous. I mean, it's like on behalf of the Center for Public Policy and also speaking on behalf of the Center for International and Comparative Studies. I mean, it's like, this was great. One of the audience members asked, I mean, it's like, we have done this in the past, I mean, before and after elections, and we're gonna revisit these themes. I mean, it's like, hopefully after, I mean, the new president is inaugurated. I mean, it's like, maybe in a year to see how our predictions worked out. In the meantime, we have another event coming up on October 19th. I mean, the second roundtable on domestic policy issues. We're, I mean, fortunate to have also a great lineup. I mean, it's like, it will be moderated by Professor Zwald. We have Professor Beth Simas from Political Science, Professor Ryan Kennedy from Political Science, Professor Johanna Latrell from the Hobby School. I will be one of the panelists, and we'll have Senator Dean Watson as one of the speakers. We look forward to having you on that webinar, October 19th at 3 p.m. Thank you all, and as good academics, we went beyond the time that was allocated for us. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you. That was nice. Thanks very much, guys.
Bye.